we are providing this information, I know we always ask that you think about maybe what aspect is missing or what have we not answered. And we want to make sure that we're being as comprehensive in this analysis as possible. Go ahead to the next slide. So, as we've seen traffic continue to rebound, I think we're to sort of pre-COVID levels, and time of day, I think, is still, important to those peak travel periods, but we're starting to see, more traffic during the day even than what we had before the pandemic. And I think this project just continues to grow in importance. And I want to, take this, but this is kind of the final meeting that we have more data to present to you. And it kind of, is the summation of all of the work we've been doing, at least regarding the toll feasibility piece. And I want to thank you all for being a part of this conversation. And as we move into, after we present kind of the data and we start talking about the path forward, I really want to hear from you all what you've been hearing in the community, any issues that have come up or areas that we need to do additional education. Your feedback is so important, and just want to thank you all for the time that you've committed and being part of the advisory group. Your job's not over yet after today, but I really appreciate all the time and energy, and I know we've had a lot of meetings in a short time and you've seen a lot of information. So as we move into the next slides here, I'll look forward to the discussion at the end as you kind of put the final puzzle pieces together and have any input or feedback you'd like to provide. Next slide. All right, and so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cameron. I also want to say, noise has been a big issue, and we've got Cameron. We also have a expert in noise analysis with us on the phone or on the meeting. And so I'm happy that we've been able to kind of put some information around this question as it becomes a more and more important topic. So Cameron, go ahead.
All right, well, thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. Appreciate you joining us again here. This is our third advisory group in about 5 weeks or 6 weeks, something like that. So as Lindsay said, we've been putting a lot of information to you here over the last 6 weeks or so, and that'll be the case today. But we do have maybe, I'll say, a shorter amount of prepared content here so that we can have that more time available for conversation here towards the end, as Lindsay just mentioned. But we do want to start off here today with discussing two topics where we continue to get a lot of questions, one of which is noise. And what is the analysis that we're doing relative to noise? Are noise walls or other mitigation strategies going to become part of this project? This comes up with you all, Tom, John, I know you guys have both raised the issue several times, as well as others. It's come up in public meetings, and we do have some stakeholder groups and property owners along the corridor where we know that this is their main issue of concern. So I want to just say up front, we do not have the final noise study results here to share with you today. We've been consistently, saying that we would have those results in the summertime, which is still the case. But what I do want to do today, better than what we've done previously, is kind of go into what goes into that analysis and why certain decisions need to be made before we can provide that full set of results. So if you want to go to the next slide. So maybe let's start off by answering the question, what is noise? So you guys are aware of sounds measured in decibels. In this slide, it'll just illustrate some common decibel levels for various kind of everyday noise sources. So for example, vacuum cleaner running in your house, that's about a 70 decibel level, whereas your common office environment or library might be about 40 decibels. If you come to an engineering office, it's probably even quieter than 40 decibels. But the thing that's most important for our purposes is that 66 decibel threshold. So that's the average sound level threshold where highway noise impacts may occur according to the federal guidelines and also KDOT's noise policy. And this is if you kind of think about that level of sound, it's essentially similar to a normal volume conversation becoming hard to understand. So it's where if the noise is loud enough, you couldn't stand next to somebody and have kind of a normal volume conversation without straining. This sound level becomes the threshold for determining impacts and evaluating mitigation measures. And there's really two sets of guidance that govern how this analysis is to be performed. There's the federal noise regulations, which establish these standards for traffic noise abatement, and making sure that those are consistent with the environment and get incorporated into the environmental assessment. And then there's the state level KDOT noise policy. And the KDOT noise policy is where we really get into some of the specifics about how the federal guidance is to be applied specifically on KDOT projects, which is what I'm going to discuss on the next slide. So Michael, if you want to move to the next one. Okay, so if we follow both the federal and KDOT noise policies, how do we determine whether there are noise impacts and whether abatement measures like noise walls will be included as part of the project? Well, first, in terms of the types of projects that require this analysis under both KDOT policy and federal policy, any project that adds capacity or significantly changes the alignment of the highway requires a noise study. So clearly, US 69 is we're going to do both of those things. We're going to be adding additional lanes to the roadway, and there will be changes in certain locations in the alignments and profiles of the roadway. So I want to point out that this is the case regardless of whether US 69 is improved with express lanes or whether a traditional widening approach is what moves forward. So no matter what, the full noise analysis has to be done regardless of which option moves forward. But that analysis is highly dependent on the specifics of the design. Key factors that impact the noise levels and effectiveness of abatement measures are things like the alignment of the roadway. How close is that roadway to the adjacent properties? What's the terrain like and the elevation difference, say, between the roadway and the surrounding properties, which affects how the sound radiates away from the roadway. We've discussed this at previous meetings, but we're really considering these two alternatives, express lanes and the traditional widening approach, and they look very different. The traditional widening has a larger footprint, and in some locations is going to put the edges of the roadway closer to those adjacent properties. So the reason why we don't have the full noise study completed at this time, and why we won't until we get into the summer, is because we really need to make the decision on which of those options is moving forward. The decision on which of those moves forward is going to be, we think, proceeding here in the next several months. And once that decision is made, express lanes versus traditional widening, we'll need to take that specific design through the noise analysis process. In terms of what goes into that analysis, so there's essentially three criteria that you have to consider when evaluating noise. So first, are the abatement measures warranted? Meaning, are the future sound levels predicted to be at or above that 66 decibel threshold in any locations along the roadway? And this is modeled using, again, the roadway design, the specifics of that, the levels of traffic, and the terrain as inputs in some federal noise analysis software. And then second, for the locations where abatement is found to be warranted, are the options for reducing the sound levels? They're evaluated based on feasibility, meaning, is there a way to actually provide a meaningful reduction in sound? And are those solutions reasonable? Meaning, do they provide good levels of sound reduction for a reasonable cost? The target that we look for is attempting to reduce those sound levels by about 7 to 10 decibels. And maybe that doesn't sound significant, but to kind of put that in perspective, a 5 decibel reduction is easy to distinguish, and about a 10 decibel reduction is perceived as half as loud. So that 7 to 10 decibel reduction is meaningful. The question really is, what is the effectiveness of the solutions? And they vary depending on the specifics of the terrain and the design. Is there a solution that can be built that actually makes a difference? And assuming that there is a solution that makes a difference, can that be done for a reasonable cost? And the threshold or the criteria that KDOT's noise policy puts forward is that abatement measures are found to be reasonable if the cost of the solution is at or below $30,000 per benefited receptor. Meaning, can the abatement measure be built for a cost that when divided by the number of properties it will benefit, are the costs below that level? So when the preferred option is chosen, we'll take that specific solution through this cost analysis and see if they meet that reasonable criteria. All this to say, there's a lot that goes into this. It's highly dependent on the specifics of the design. And so really that first decision that has to be made is which of these alternatives is moving forward, the express lanes alternative or the traditional widening. And once that decision is made, then we'll do the full noise analysis, kind of consistent with the criteria that I just laid out there. So said a bit of a mouthful. I want to take a pause there and kind of open it up to questions. As Lindsay mentioned, we also have John Fitzpatrick with us. He's done a lot of these noise analyses, both in Kansas and in other states. And if there's technical questions that are beyond what I can answer, he can help us out with some of that. So I'll take a pause there.
Cameron, this is Fred Spears.
Yes, sir.
And I'm not an expert in noise by any means, but my understanding is the dB scale, decibel scale, is not linear. So if I hear a 50 decibel noise and a 100 decibel noise, that 100 isn't twice as much as 50, it's geometrically more. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I'm sure that John can tell us a little bit more about that. But yes, it's not linear. It's not proportional like that. It's not twice as loud if it's twice the decibels. That's why you see, like, you know, a 5 decibel reduction is audible and noticeable, but a 10 decibel reduction is half as loud.
Yeah,
Okay.
noise levels
Thank
are
you.
logarithmic. So if you added 2 sound levels, if you had 2 noise levels at 50 decibels and you added them together, it's not going to be 100 decibels. It'll be a 3 decibel increase. So it'll be 53 decibels. So yeah, it's logarithmic. It's not geometric or linear, like you said.
Other questions? All right. Well, again, just to kind of summarize here, you know, the fact that these footprints look different between the 2 options really kind of drives us in a direction where we need to kind of settle on which of these options is going to move forward, and then we'll take it through the full noise analysis, like what we would do on really any project that adds capacity.
I've got a second question, Cameron. It's Fred Spears again. Did I step on somebody? How effective are noise walls?
So they can be effective for I'll say the first row of receptors, the folks that are immediately adjacent to the noise walls. They can be less effective the further you get away from that as you move into the second and third rows of receptors. So it varies a lot depending on your proximity to the wall or to that abatement measure.
Hey, Cameron, you also have a question from Julie Brewer.
Oh, okay.
Hey, Cameron. So I understand the premise that, hey, it depends on what we do as a response to really do then the effective noise research. So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg conversation. The one thing I struggle with a little bit is, what if the chicken and the egg conversation is an influencer on which would be the best response? In other words, so maybe I want the world and it's not possible. But to me, if you go down one path and you find out what the noise impact looks like for that path, you really never know what the noise impact looks like for that other path, and if that difference would have been an influencer on how to make that decision. Does that make sense? Does my question make sense?
No, I do understand what you're saying. It is possible to do sort of a comparative analysis where you basically take both of these options through that similar analysis. I think, the approach that we've been taking is trying to focus on maybe that nearer term decision of whether or not we're going to proceed with a toll project, just because that's has such an impact on this. But it is possible that you take both of those through there. Now, to the extent does the analysis vary greatly between the two? The only thing that I could say about that without, you know, us getting into more detail on it is one of the big factors that affects the noise levels at those receptors is distance from the roadway to those receptors. And so to the extent that we're looking at options that try and keep the footprint compact and don't just build lanes of the roadway up to the right-of-way line, those should be beneficial. So, you know, from a qualitative perspective, the smaller the footprint, the further you are away from the first rows of adjacent properties, you know, theoretically, the better that should look.
Cameron, Tom had a question.
Yeah, I thought I saw.
No, mine was down a similar path of what Julie was going, but she always asks questions much better than I do. So I'm good with what she said.
Very good.
One thing I'll add that might help explain is there's usually not drastic differences based on the alternatives, and related to the question earlier, you would have to double the traffic to get a 3 decibel increase. So there's usually not huge differences between the noise levels in the future. It's much more, can that noise be abated? So like Cameron said, there might be some differences, but keeping that footprint smaller is probably kind of the qualitative way to look at it.
Okay, well, thank you guys. If there's any other questions here, feel free to reach out to us too. If not, then maybe let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so another topic where we continue to get a lot of questions is related to environmental justice and equity, especially as it relates to tolling and the financial impacts on communities of concern. This comes up again in nearly every setting where we're talking to people about this, whether that's public meetings or whether it's with you as our advisory group. And Julie, Reverend Hamilton, you know, I know you guys have brought this up on several occasions as well as others. So I think the first thing that we want to say with respect to this is this is important to us as well. It's important to KDOT and their other partners to make sure that we're looking for and finding, you know, meaningful ways to mitigate this.
Yeah, that's just if you wanted to say something to them.
Audio.
Sorry, John, we can come back to you here in just a second if we need to. So I was starting to say, you know, this is obviously an important topic to KDOT and their partners as well. But it's also a complicated topic. We're not, you know, similar to the noise analysis, we're not going to show you a full proposal on how to address all these concerns today. And the reason for that is really because for these strategies to be effective, we have to engage with these underserved communities and work with them to develop the right solutions. Those are going to take a little bit of time to do that. But what I do want to talk through here today is the approach that our team wants to take to actually working with those communities to try and develop those right mitigation strategies. Before we do that, and before we go there, I do want to spend a little bit of time on some of the things that we're, say, already doing as part of the approach that we've developed for the express lanes to try and lessen the impacts relative to tolling on some of these communities of concern. And when we talk about communities of concern, we're really defining these as two different distinct populations, low income being one and minority populations being the other. So as we kind of talk through this, that's what we mean by communities of concern. So we're going to talk about some certain things that we're already doing, and then kind of the approach to trying to get into a much more deep conversation with those communities of concern about ways to actually reduce these impacts. Should you go to the next slide? Okay, so shown on this slide are many of the things that we already anticipate doing should the express lanes move forward. And these are things we've discussed with this group as we've kind of worked through what this could look like on US 69. And many of these strategies we believe could benefit particularly low income populations. So the first strategy is just with respect to the way that the toll rates are set for US 69. So first of all, the usage of the lanes is a choice, and by managing the toll rates so that we get the best performance across all the lanes, the toll-free lanes are going to see better speeds as compared to what's there today. And again, with that approach to managing the toll rates that's focused on maximizing throughput and reducing congestion, not just in the express lanes, but across all the lanes, the rates are set to provide that best performance across the system, not to maximize the amount of revenue that could be generated from the lane. So this keeps those toll rates reasonable. And as we showed the last time, those rates are going to be below the national average. And really all users benefit from that additional capacity with the express lanes being added. But we do see, as we look at how these operate and how they're used across the country, the low income populations do use the express lanes when it's important to them. So that next strategy is about minimizing the barriers to using the express lane so they can also benefit from the higher speed, more reliable trip. So what we mean by this is to make it as easy as possible for people to choose the express lanes when it's most important to them. And there are several parts to this strategy, many of which are actually inherent in how KTA either operates today or how they will operate prior to US 69 opening to traffic. These include, first, the low cost of a K-tag. It's free to get a K-tag, and customers have a choice about whether they want to link that to a bank account or to a credit card. But not everybody has a credit card or a bank account. So to make it easier for those customers, KTA allows the use of Bank Pass, which is a toll tag that's similar to a K-tag, but is reloadable using cash. So you don't have to link it to a credit card or a bank account. Doesn't require any minimum balance, and the account can be reloaded with cash through partnerships of various retailers like a CVS or a Costco or Walgreens. So this allows someone without a bank account or a credit card to be able to reload that with cash, one of those partner retail locations. Then the next strategy is by allowing video tolling. Many low-income customers may only use the express lanes occasionally when it's most important to them. But using a K-tag or even a bank pass does require some advanced planning, and you have to set up those accounts. So by allowing video in the express lanes, an occasional user doesn't have to pre-plan. They don't have to set up an account, and they don't have to manage an account for infrequent use. They can just use it when it's most important to them, and then pay the toll after they've already gotten the benefit of the express lanes. And then regardless of whether they pay using a tag like a K-tag or they use video, the tolls are all post-paid. There's no need to prepay into account, which ties up money and which can be a barrier to many low-income customers. So for those of you that use a K-tag already, this may seem pretty normal. But most toll agencies actually typically require prepayment of tolls rather than paying the tolls after you've already taken the trip. So it's just another way of structuring that so that it is easier for occasional users to use the express lanes. Then, we've discussed this before, but we view the express lanes as having some significant benefits also for transit service on US 69. Allowing the buses to run in the express lane means that there's another option or another way to access the higher speed, more reliable trip besides just using your personal vehicle. The express lane is really a way for transit service to actually provide a premium service at the times that could be, potentially better than driving your own personal vehicle. And KDOT is committed to developing a rate structure for transit vehicles that keeps those costs low while still meeting the requirements of the tolling legislation that's in place. And then maybe the last thing that I want to bring up here is just the smaller overall footprint with the express lanes. It helps keep the impacts on surrounding properties reduced. And some of those surrounding properties are identified as having higher percentages of low income or minority populations. So these are just wanted to kind of run through some of the things that we feel are already part of how we would envision this going forward. But Michael, if you want to go to the next slide, we definitely recognize that this still may not, those steps that we're already taking still may not avoid or minimize or mitigate all the impacts to these underserved communities. So for this reason, we're committed to kind of working with those communities of concern to see if there's additional steps that need to be taken. And as I said before, for this to really be effective, this isn't something that KDOT can do alone. There needs to be intentional dialogue with those underserved communities to understand, what really are those impacts and what are the ways of reducing the impacts that are actually effective. So what this slide shows is the process that we would intend to follow to develop these mitigation strategies, and really that would occur over the course of several years. What our team's currently doing is really in that prepare section of the process. We have collected data on the potential communities of concern in the corridor and beyond just the immediate corridor, and have evaluated practices that are put in place on other express lane facilities around the country. That next step is really where we're headed next, which is to engage. And KDOT and their partners, we need to meet with these communities and discuss the impacts and how best to reduce that. So this process, again, if we're going to do it well, it's not something that we can just do in a matter of a couple of months. It's going to take some time, and depending on the mitigation strategy, might require changes in KDOT policies, potentially even KDOT or Kansas statutes, as well as coordination with organizations beyond just KDOT and KTA in the city of Overland Park in order to implement. I'd say the good news is we have time to do this correctly. The express lanes, should they move forward, won't open to traffic until 2025. So there's time to engage, time to do it right, and time to get the programs in place that actually provide some meaningful mitigation. So again, another mouthful there. I want to take another pause there and open this up for questions, and also Gretchen and Brandon, some of our other folks are available too to help with questions if you have them.
This is Carlos with the Hispanic Chamber. Just let me know if we can help with any roundtables with the Spanish-speaking community.
Yes.
To get their input. We
would very much like that. I think that, as we kind of looked, I will say, as we look to our advisory group here, if you all are willing, and I appreciate, Carlos, you bringing that up, we're very interested in working with some of the members of our advisory group too here to help us make this effective and effectively reach out to those communities and work through what these strategies would actually be meaningful to them. So I appreciate that.
And Cameron, Julie Brewer had to drop off for a minute, but she says UCS is happy to assist as well as things move forward.
Very good. I appreciate that, Julie.
As can the Workforce Partnership. Keely has offered that as well.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you guys being willing to assist with that. I think for it to be done right, you guys are closest to the groups that you're here representing and have an interest in how this moves forward. So we will certainly take you up on the offers here. Any other questions or things? Does this make sense?
Cameron,
go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. This is Keely Schneider with Workforce Partnership. Just a quick question. I know that we're talking specifically here about low-income communities and communities of color, but in terms of engagement, have we already engaged, for example, companies and their needs for the transportation of their own employees that sit along this corridor? And is that, a group that you're engaging with? I think for me, focused on workforce development, how one of the magic wands I wish I owned was a magic wand over transportation, right? If I could get workers that need jobs to the areas where there are jobs, that would make my job so much easier. And so I know transit is always something that is difficult and challenging back and forth across the state line. It's challenging to get people, say, from Kansas City, Kansas, down to Edgerton. You know, there's all these different things that I think of. And I know that that's not this project, and I respect that, but I'm just curious to what degree there have perhaps been conversations, I'm hoping, around as part of this, are we looking at a broader strategy around transit and trying to find more options for people, you know, up and down this corridor to be able to get to work more easily?
Well, I think you bring up a good point. We have had some, I'll say, individualized conversations with businesses along the corridor that have requested that. We've been able to meet with them one-on-one, and they're usually pretty clear about the things that they, you know, think might benefit their specific business. Also, I think a big part of that is including the chamber as part of this group and closely coordinating with the chamber, and we're going to be in front of them a handful of times. But certainly, if there are, you know, some business groups that we need to be engaging with as this continues to move forward, yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea, and we'd certainly want to talk to you more about that. I don't know, Lindsay, if you have any other thoughts on that, but I think it's a good strategy.
Yeah, I think so too. And I know, you know, we've had some conversations with Mid-America Regional Council and KCATA as we look at different transit options, and they're really looking into microtransit as something that might be able to fill a need instead of kind of those set routes. Anyway, I think, you know, we would be happy if there's a specific business that you're working with and we want to talk just to them. I think the outreach, if express toll lanes is the decision to move forward with, I think there is going to be an extensive public education and outreach effort to help everyone understand how to use this, and those business impacts or benefits that a business could see from it would definitely be part of that conversation. And I see Tracy has a comment in the chat about Ride KC and including something like this in the strategic plan to look at that. And yeah, Keely, I think we would be happy to bring you in to those conversations that we would have with businesses. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. It's just one of the number one things that we actually talk about is transportation. Yeah, this is great.
I remember having conversations with Smartport about, you know, getting folks from Kansas City, Kansas down to the intermodal. I think there's a big regional effort to try and pair those folks that need a job with where the jobs are. And it's not going to be unique to this corridor, but I think KDOT and Overland Park, the chamber, I think all of us are very interested in how we can better move people where they want to go. I mean, that's the service KDOT provides, and we certainly want to be engaged in those conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Carlos, I think you got a question.
Yes, I apologize. I'm traveling, so I apologize the noise. Well, first of all, I want to say that was a very good point. I might recommend we get some of the owners of the staffing agencies. Al Balaki from Labor Max is on my board. I could tell you Alliance, they are servicing all those manufacturers, light manufacturers in that corridor, and they can probably get some good insight on the transportation needs because they're dealing with the day staffers that those companies are using every day. Going back to the underserved communities, you know, I can tell you what's going to come up, and you probably already heard it. That individual that may use it once and not realize they're using that and getting charged. What is the collection process? Some of the underserved communities, especially the poor, the car may not be registered in their name, so the bill may go to a parent, a grandparent, and even in another city. And then is that going to revoke their driver's license if they don't pay it? Those are the concerns I think you're going to hear, is the collection process for those that don't understand how it's working.
Yeah, I think you bring up some really good points there. You know, a lot of those are going to be there is sort of a, I'll say, a standard escalation process that would be similar here as to what you would see on the broader Kansas Turnpike. But you know, some of that has to be a case by case kind of discussion as you work through that. So no, I think that's a good point though. And yeah, I would say that would be an expected issue that we would need to work through.
We will have to sit down with the Turnpike Authority and figure out all of those sort of operational pieces. And I would say that part of developing that framework, the city is going to have a lot of opportunity to continue to stay involved and make sure they're okay with kind of how this is getting set up. And we would continue to take feedback and input through that process as well.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Again, I expect these last two topics will continue to be ones where we get questions, and we really appreciate you guys, the feedback from you all, because it helps us prepare and helps us understand kind of what the issues are that we need to be considering as this continues to take shape. We want to move on to traffic and revenue then. Okay, so we're going to kind of turn to our second section of the meeting, which is to cover the results from the traffic and revenue analysis. This is the analysis that shows us, or that allows us to predict the level of revenue that might be generated from tolls applied on the express lanes on US 69. So we're going to cover what the forecast scenarios were that we considered. We're going to talk about the gross revenue, or the total amount of dollars that might get collected from tolling the express lanes. Talk about the associated costs associated with operating and maintaining the toll system, because it does have some associated costs with it. And then the resulting net revenue and what's left over after that, both on an annual and a cumulative basis. So if you go to the next slide. So before we just dive into all the graphs and results and everything, I want to just say one more time that what the purpose is of these express lanes. And we say this every chance we get, but I think it can't be said enough, that the purpose of applying tolls to the express lanes is really because they are a tool to achieve the project goals, which are to reduce congestion across the entire system, both the express lanes and the general purpose lanes, and a tool for ensuring that we can provide a reliable trip now and as traffic continues to grow into the future. The purpose of the tolls is not to make a profit or to maximize the amount of money that can be raised off of the express lane. So for this reason, we're intentionally proposing to keep the toll rates as low as possible while still achieving the congestion management goals. So you go to the next slide. But you know, the effect of applying the tolls, even modestly priced tolls, is that they will generate revenue. But in KDOT, in this case, which is very unique, is willing to view this revenue as Overland Parks, or the city's local contribution to this project. Once we've gone through the revenue results, Lindsay's going to talk more about the local contribution and how tolls could fit into that. But the bottom line is that the revenue from tolling, it really offers the community another mechanism or another way to raise their local contribution if they choose to do so. And flip to the next slide. And just as a reminder, you know, this philosophy or this approach to developing the toll rates, how it compares against other express lanes in the United States. I know we showed this to you last time, but we do predict that the rates will be below the national average, and that we can effectively manage congestion at the rates that are less than what's needed in California or Florida, where the congestion is much worse than what we see on US 69. So with those low toll rates, the good question is, if you apply those low toll rates, will it actually generate adequate revenue? And we believe that it will. So flip to the next slide. But we do have to consider the fact that we have a good sense of what traffic is doing now and what it has done historically, but there is uncertainty about what happens in the future. So this is a slide that is a throwback from a couple of meetings ago, where we talked about there's different ways that the region could grow. And the difference in that growth impacts traffic differently. So generally speaking, growth in population and growth in employment drives the growth in traffic, and the growth in traffic drives the potential toll revenue that could be generated. So the revenue projections we've developed them two different ways that essentially account for two different growth scenarios. One is based on the growth model developed by Mid-America Regional Council, and that's represented by that red dotted line that you see here. This is the adopted growth model for really the entire region, and it takes into account the most current land use plans for the city of Overland Park. But we also want to have a more conservative look at this to make sure we're not over-representing what revenue might be generated from the express lanes. So we developed a second, more conservative growth forecast, which more closely follows that orange dashed line there. And this is really to account for uncertainty on whether the long-term growth trends happen as quickly as what might be shown in the MARC model, or if there's other factors that affect, that affect whether the increases in population employment actually translate into increased traffic. So using kind of those two different forecasts, we've projected the anticipated revenue that could be generated from the express lane. So Michael, if you want to flip to the next slide. So what's shown here, this illustrates the predicted gross revenues from the express lanes based on these two different growth forecasts. There's obviously, there's differences between the two. So if you look at the blue line, that's the potential annual revenue, annual gross revenue that we predict could be generated from the express lanes if the MARC forecast becomes the way that the city develops and the way that traffic grows on US 69. Using that more conservative approach, that's what you see there in the yellow line. So if you look in the early years, they essentially start from the same place of generating somewhere just north of maybe $2.5–3 million a year in the early years, but then they obviously grow over time and they diverge as you start to see the effects of the differences in how the growth projects all the way out. If you look out 25 years of operation, say out to 2050. You'll also notice the dip in the revenue there around the year 2040. The reason for that is that the city has in their long-range plans to improve the parallel arterial streets, so Antioch and Metcalf, that run parallel to US 69, and particularly in that southern part of the corridor. There's plans to improve those from what they are today. And in our model, after we kind of talked through this with the city of Overland Park, we modeled these as being open to traffic in the year 2040. So the effect of this is that you build those parallel arterials or you expand them, some of the traffic does leave US 69 and begin using those arterial streets. This is really a phenomenon that would occur regardless of whether or not there's express lanes on US 69 or not. But what it does is it has the effect of creating, I'll say, a short-term dip in the toll revenue before it starts to take off again. So this is kind of what the revenue projections look like from a gross revenue perspective. But now we need to consider some of the costs associated with operating and maintaining the system. So if you want to flip to that next slide. So again, what we just went through is gross revenue or the total dollars that we predict could be collected from the express lanes. But there's, again, costs associated with operating the system and maintaining the system that have to come out of that gross revenue to work your way down to the net revenue. And it's the net revenue that's really important because that's the revenue that can be applied to the city's local contribution. So if we kind of work through this, the first piece of this that comes out of the gross revenue is what we call leakage. So this is either you get a bad read on a license plate or somebody's tag isn't working or whatever the case may be, but it's a trip that is not possible to actually collect the tolls from those trips. So there is some portion of the users where there'll be some technical issues like that, and we have to account for that. Then the next piece of this is the actual cost of processing the transaction or taking the transaction and working it through KTA's back office to either apply that to a KTAG account or to send somebody a bill if they're choosing to pay via video. Then the next couple of pieces are associated with operating and maintaining the actual physical toll system that's in the roadway. It's an additional, all of the infrastructure that's out there requires maintenance at some level, and the toll systems are no different. In this case, the maintenance of just the toll systems would come out of those gross revenues. We're not talking about maintaining the roadway now out of toll revenue. That's something that will continue to be done by KDOT out of I'll say the traditional revenues that come into KDOT, but it's just the maintenance and the operations of that toll system. So if we take those things off the top, that's how we get from gross revenue to net revenue. So if you flip to the next slide. So kind of taking into account those costs, this slide shows what this looks like from a net revenue perspective. So thinking back to the graph I showed a couple slides ago, that blue line, that's the growth revenue, in this case under that marked growth forecast. And the orange bars we're taking off from that, we're subtracting off of that gross revenue, the costs associated with operating and maintaining the toll system. And what's left in green, that's the net revenue. And there's a couple of takeaways as we look at what the net revenue looks like here under this particular forecast. So first of all, it's net revenue positive every year. There's never a year where we anticipate that the costs are going to exceed the revenues that are brought in. And that really leads us to believe that even applying those lower toll rates, express lanes are a viable solution for US 69 and financially responsible. And if you look at that over time, it might starts low in the early years like you might expect, but as traffic continues to grow and there's more and more users that are on the corridor, period, but also users that elect to use the express lanes, those revenues do grow over time. Again, a little dip there around the year 2040 as some of those parallel routes start to come online. Flip to the next slide. So that was kind of the previous slide really honed in on that growth scenario that's based on the MARC forecast, but comparing that against both the MARC forecast, but also that more conservative growth, what does that look like? Well, the revenue is certainly lower. If you look on the right side of this slide, we've now added that conservative growth forecast side by side, and the yellow line, certainly the gross revenue is lower, and that does produce lower net revenues. But similar to the MARC forecast, it is net revenue positive every year. So again, even under that more conservative growth forecast, we still see this as financially responsible, and both of them have positive net revenue that can be applied towards the city's local contribution. So if you flip to the next slide, so all these
Cameron,
Yeah.
before you go on, I think Greg had a question regarding is inflation factored into the long-range revenue and cost estimates? And if you could just do a quick summary of how you prepared those estimates.
Yeah, so there is inflation taken into account here. So that's accounted for both on the revenue side and on the cost side. But I'd say it's more important on the cost side, because on the revenue side, the dollars that you bring in are really driven by demand. So as the traffic increases, you're not artificially escalating the toll rates in those peak periods. It's really being driven by demand. But we are accounting for the fact that some of our costs, or the costs of maintenance and things like that, does escalate. So those are factored in as we kind of look out in the outer years. So I hope I'm answering your question there. And then the how long are we projecting out? We've shown this to 2050. We have done some longer range forecasts, but that go beyond that point. But we kind of showed the 2050 timeframe because that's really I'll say the design horizon for a lot of the break and access and traffic analysis that we're doing.
Cameron, my question really was, when you determine revenue, are you taking the anticipated tolling rates and in 2025, and revenues are simply based on the number of cars using it, or do toll rates go up every 5 years or 10 years or whatever? Because I think somebody's going to ask that, and I want to be transparent about it, that we anticipate that just like gas taxes probably need to go up, at some point toll rates will need to go up.
Yeah, so there's two pieces of that, Greg. So there's I'll say the minimum toll. So when it's not congested out there and the toll rates are set just to essentially cover the costs, those do have an inflation factor kind of built into that. So yes, we would expect that to escalate over time at some nominal amount. It's the tolls during the peak times are what is really being driven by demand. So we have modeled what those increased rates would be, and you're exactly right. The peak rates that we've been talking about up to this point have been more focused on the early years of operation. But if we look out 15 years, as traffic continues to grow and demand really dictates that we need to raise those rates in order to still have that congestion management benefit, we do have projections of what those rates would look like in some of the outer years. We'd be happy to share those with you. I don't know them off the top of my head, but it's certainly something we can provide. But yeah, that is the intent. But that upper range isn't increased based on inflation the way the lower range is. It's really being driven by demand.
I don't need the details. I just want to make sure we understand the concept. This isn't a flat rate for
That's
the next
correct.
25 years.
Yeah, generally speaking, as the region grows and traffic grows and there's more demand and it requires a little higher toll rates in order to manage the congestion, yes, in the outer years you would see higher toll rates than what you see in the early years. But still using that approach of making sure that you're keeping those rates at the levels that are putting you in the best position to manage the traffic effectively across the network.
Cameron, in a similar vein, Ron has asked, are these gross revenue estimates only based on average toll rates? If so, what are the maximum and minimum rates anticipated for peak and off-peak periods?
So they're not based on the average. They're based on the actual numbers of users that are modeled on an hourly basis with the rates that change based on the level of traffic that you see in those hours of the day. So it's not based on the average. And that is like a constantly fluctuating thing over the course of an entire, over a number of years, as both the traffic increases and those toll rates increase. So yeah, and then I think the second question, Ron, is maybe getting a little bit similar back to Greg's, is that the off-peak rates would escalate based on inflation, some nominal amount, but then the maximum rates or those peak rates, they do increase over time as well, based on the increase in demand.
Thanks, Cameron. It might be helpful to develop some sort of a graphic to be able to show how that would work. To accompany these sort of annual figures.
I hope that makes sense. That makes sense. Any other questions before we kind of move on here? And before I turn it over to Lindsay, I got one more slide. Okay, so these graphs that we've been looking at here have all been showing net revenue on I'll say an annual basis. But again, KDOT is really viewing this net revenue as an opportunity to apply that net revenue as the city's local contribution. So the question really becomes is, as you stack up all the green bars that you saw in those previous graphs, how does that accumulate into a total net revenue over a period of time? So as an example, we've shown here of, if the target was say $20 million, we're trying to generate $20 million by using the net toll revenue as the source of that. We start to look at present valuing that $20 million based on the two different growth forecasts. So if we look at this, if you look at the blue line, that shows how the net revenue accumulates over a period of years. And what we're showing is that you would essentially hit that equivalent $20 million present value in the year 2037. It takes longer if the lower growth forecast becomes reality. If reality looks like that and it's a little slower, then you reach that equivalent 20 million present value by about the year 2042. So the intent with this is to kind of show what does that range look like depending on how growth could occur. Of if $20 million is the target, how many years does it take to operate the system before you might reach that target? I would say 2040 is also a convenient time for us to look at, because if we just take a slice of US 69, say south of 151st Street, and when does the existing roadway in that part of the corridor, even further south down to 179th, when do we start to need the actual 6-lane roadway down in that area? We projected it would be somewhere around this 2040 time period where that wouldn't probably be warranted in those locations. And so that kind of puts depending on how the region grows and how the toll revenues actually come in, kind of puts these at a decision point where you're wrestling with, you know, how did those tolls make sense based on just leaving them in the section that's from 151st Street to the north, or potentially applying that on that second piece that would go down to 179th Street. So wanted to kind of show how that stacks up from a cumulative standpoint. So with that, I'm going to stop here, see if anybody's got any additional questions on this component of it before I turn it over to Lindsay and kind of walk us through where we go from here.
So Cameron, I just wanted to make the point for the group, the 26.1 million or the 27.5 million, those numbers are based on a $20 million net present value contribution in 2023, which is when construction would begin. So we've applied some inflation at an average of 2.5% per year to inflate what that contribution needs to be at the end of the collection. So I just wanted to clarify that point in case you were wondering, well, where did 26.1 or 27.5 come from? That is those intended. And I know where we sit today, 2042 seems like a long time. But in 2025, if you were to issue bonds to support construction of this project, you know, you're looking at a 12 to 17-year payoff, and many of KDOT's bonds are 20-year bonds. So it kind of fits right in with what that debt structure could look like. Of course, we would not be using the toll revenue to issue toll revenue financing or bonds just specifically for that, but as a comparative on, you know, infrastructure investment, that is a common kind of payback period. So KDOT would be comfortable kind of, you know, assembling that local contribution over that 12 to 17 years.
All right.
Okay. All right. So kind of the third phase of the meeting, talking about the path forward. Go ahead to the next slide. So as we look at, and we talked a lot about these charts at the last meeting, the express lanes on the left versus the traditional widening on the right, overall construction cost value is there. It saved the state and community, you know, $85 million in construction costs to manage the traffic with an express toll lane versus doing traditional widening. Go ahead to the next, Michael. So when we look at what the potential local contribution would be with both alternatives, you can see, you know, with the express tolling option, and Cameron has covered this, to make an express tolling option work, you have to build the full $300 million first phase, which is what is indicated there in like the yellowy orange. And we're looking at about a 7% contribution, which would be kind of $20 million estimate there. Go ahead. And so if you look at the entirety of that $655 million project, you're looking at, you know, a potential contribution of about $53 million versus the traditional widening. Go ahead and insert that. You have 9 different phases. Those first 3 phases are about 300 million. So we're looking at sort of a $20 million or 7% contribution that could be upfront cash, or if you wanted to do kind of like a payment plan, $2 million a year. I'll go ahead and click to the next thing. You're looking at 104 million in kind of installation or installment plan payments, with a $59 million contribution with all 9 phases. So it's a considerable difference when you think about sort of an installment payment and the inflation that would be established to that, and, you know, just a reduced impact on the local budget to come up with a cash contribution or an installment type payment plan. I would just pause there in case there's any questions about this, or if I could clarify. Okay. I don't see anything. Go ahead to the next slide, Michael. Okay, so this is just kind of another way of looking at it. So I've kind of explained what that structured payment schedule kind of could look like. If you think of the first 2 options that are there in the circles, so you could have an upfront cash contribution of 20 million for that first traditional widening phase to get to that $300 million level. If you had structured payments, that would amount to about 22 million over 10 years to build to that local contribution. That both of those options would have an impact to the traditional city revenue sources. So as they look at the revenue sources for their CIP, you know, you're looking at kind of taking money out of that to provide that local contribution towards the project. Whereas on the express toll lane option, you know, KDOT is pulling those toll revenues as the local contribution to the project. It would be, you know, collected over that sort of 12 to 17 year time frame between 26 million and 28 million, depending on traffic. That revenue and inflation risk is all on KDOT. There wouldn't be any requirement that you had to hit a certain payback period for that toll revenue. We would just kind of continue to build those toll revenues until such time that that agreed upon local contribution is reached. Go ahead to the next slide. Now, one piece, and I know that there are members of the advisory group that are very interested in when we would get to that 167th Street interchange. We have put in a request to Congresswoman David's office for $15 million in an earmark for this extension. That is something that we've done sort of strategically. If that earmark is awarded, we could move forward with a standalone project. There are considerable local system improvements that are made with this overall $30 million project. So as an example, as an estimate, we've included a $10 million local contribution for that project. It's pretty close to what's in the CIP now for Overland Park. KDOT would contribute an additional $5 million to make that project happen. And that could be just a standalone 167th Street interchange project. If we were able to incorporate this into the express toll lane project, we could raise an additional 10 million in toll revenue to be that local contribution by adding this interchange into that overall US 69 alternative delivery projects. So we could incorporate this, it would just become part of that express lane widening, and potentially use toll revenue as the local match on that as well. So if you see there in the red boxes, it really kind of calls out that impact to the local budget. You have about 10 million in a standalone versus no impact to the current Overland Park budget by you being able to utilize that toll revenue to help contribute to that additional expansion. And I don't think I have to tell anybody on this call, but with the Advent Health Facility and additional development on this 167th Street corridor, there have been plans on the books for a while with Overland Park really wanting KDOT to replace those bridges that are, for US 69 so that they can expand 167th Street underneath. It's a huge kind of bottleneck right now for additional growth and expansion. And so we know that it's a high priority for the community to get this addressed. I will say with that additional toll revenue, and it's noted here on the slide, that this would extend the express tolling operations to, a few extra years there, maybe an additional 5 years if we had very low traffic projections. If our traffic growth matched those lower projections, it would extend it out longer. So I did want to point that out, but it's a good option to kind of get this additional piece done at the same time as the widening on US 69. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So this, I'm going to walk through this kind of slowly, and I want you all to write down your questions. And I can completely understand, if we spend a little bit of time discussing this. So what we tried to do is really put on paper sort of a decision tree as we see it from the KDOT perspective. So really the first question that we need to ask is Overland Park going to provide a local contribution commitment? And if the answer to that is yes, then the question of what is that local contribution and what is the timing of that contribution? So, if they wanted to provide $20 million tomorrow and move forward with traditional widening, we could move a $300 million phase into the construction pipeline. We're expecting our first construction pipeline announcement to be in June of this year. And so this project would be eligible to enter into that pipeline. The $22 million in installments, if we were able to commit to $2 million a year, we need to inflate that $20 million to get that net present value. But that could be paid off in 10 years at like $2.2 million a year. If we look at express toll lanes as the option, we have to continue through that decision-making process. But if Overland Park wanted to do that, we could take that proposal to the Turnpike Authority and the State Finance Council and still have that $300 million phase in the construction pipeline so that we stay on schedule with kind of what we've been presenting, getting that design and construction team started in 2022. If there's a smaller contribution, something under that sort of $20 million target, and we would want to look at the scope and budget of what that contribution would allow for, and how we could fit that into the construction pipeline overall. If there is not a commitment by Overland Park to provide a local contribution, then I don't think US 69, it's just not going to be eligible for that very first construction announcement. And so we know that the construction schedule is going to slip. Because we would have to go back and kind of determine what is the scope of the project that we want to build to address some of the problems that we have right now, and what is the budget that we have available to do that. And so it's just not going to be possible to get whatever project it is that we want to move forward with first into that first construction pipeline. So that is sort of the universe of where we are right now. And I want to pause there and answer any questions you may have.
So Ron's got a question about the logic of the 20 million, 300 million kind of cost share standard.
Yeah. So
maybe on what some of the other communities around the state are doing.
Absolutely. So I think it was in the last meeting that we talked a little bit about, the pipeline and how projects get out of development and into construction under the IKE transportation program. Right now, we have 2 communities that have already committed to have a local contribution on their project. The city of Topeka has an approximately $200 million project in Polk Quincy, and they have agreed to issue $20 million in bonds to be able to provide that $20 million contribution. So they're kind of at 10%. And the city of Wichita and Sedgwick County are contributing $15 million on an $85 million project. So they actually have a slightly larger contribution. And so as we see communities kind of coming up with that range, some of the conversations that we've had with Overland Park, you know, when they do a historic look about what has Overland Park contributed percentage-wise to construction, they were sort of in that 7% range. And while we are seeing higher percentages from other communities, you know, if we're able to save 85 million in the total construction of the corridor, you know, I think that allows us to kind of go below that 10% at that 7% level and feel like we are, you know, doing our due diligence on behalf of Kansas taxpayers for the project. So that's kind of how we arrived at that 20 million. You know, obviously we haven't had any formal negotiations or discussions with the city about that amount specifically. We've just kind of projected that as a 7% match, similar to what Overland Park has done in the past.
This is Fred Spears, and I can't speak for the whole council, but I've had some conversations with a number of the members of the council, and we have a split is the best thing I can say, going one way or another. Some are in favor, some are neutral, and a couple are against it. So I couldn't give you odds or make a bet as to how the vote would be on that. So that's just my comment on that. Thank you, Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. We're going to have another round of meetings with council members by their ward. So we're hoping to kind of present this decision tree and get some feedback on how that's looking. Again, there's room to negotiate in these local contributions. There's no magic to the number, as I mentioned. So it's really about, you know, providing the best value both for the members of the community and state taxpayers. And when you think about the options here, when we're talking about the $20 million upfront or $22 million in installments, and Fred can speak to this better because he knows that local budget forwards and backwards. But those dollars, where that local contribution would come from, or even a smaller local contribution that may, you know, help determine scope, you know, those dollars are coming from, you know, general Overland Park revenues. And if there's a specific, you know, if it's sales tax, if it's property tax that you're having to generate that match from, you're impacting all taxpayers in the city. With the express tolling option, you really are having that user fee. The people that are using that additional capacity are paying for that additional capacity. And you're not, you know, imposing an increase, or you're not utilizing tax revenue that's collected from everyone, whether or not they use that facility. So I think that that's an important consideration as we're looking at what are the sources of the local contribution and what, you know, works. One other thing that I would mention as we're kind of looking at what these options are, if you go back a few meetings when we talked about where this traffic is coming from, only 50% of the traffic is originating or terminating in Overland Park. So when we look at who is going to be using the lane, there is a very good probability that at least 50% or more may be non-Overland Park residents or non-Overland Park destinations that would be using that lane for through travel. So I think that that is also an important point. If people are using that lane from out of town, not using it to get to or leave Overland Park, you know, they have the opportunity of helping to contribute to that capacity as well with the express tolling option. Okay, if there are no other questions, we'll go to the next slide. So from the KDOT perspective, after we've seen all of the data, right? Now we have the revenue, we understand the decisions before us, we understand what we need to work with the city on and what discussions we need to have. The express lanes are the best value for KDOT from our perspective. And that'll be the recommendation as far as a state perspective. Now what that local perspective is or what's best for Overland Park, we'll leave it to the city council and residents, and we're continuing to take feedback, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it's the best value for KDOT for these reasons. Under engineering, you know, we know that it's going to reduce congestion. We know it's going to improve that trip reliability, and we're going to have fewer construction impacts with the express lane option. You've got less phases, less impact to traffic. On the environmental side, we know that this is going to be a smaller footprint if we use the express toll lanes. We know that the traffic from that noise perspective, that traffic is going to be further away from those, I think the term Cameron uses is receptors, is that right? Or something like that. Yeah. So we know that smaller footprint, you're kind of keeping that traffic more inside that right of way. And we're going to have fewer environmental impacts. You have fewer, you know, taking a smaller right of way footprint. And that's a benefit. And then on the finance side, we're not setting these toll rates to make money. We're doing it to control the congestion. And with this option, we do have an overall lower construction cost, which is very important. We're going to have lower life cycle and maintenance costs because we have less pavement to maintain. We don't have to build out those collector distributor roads. And it does provide that new funding option for local partners to contribute a little bit of local contribution towards the project by using those toll revenues. So from our perspective, we do think this is the best value, but just as that toll legislation was created, we aren't going to force anyone to use this as an option. We still have options available to do a traditional widening, but we know that that is of less value overall for the state than the express toll lane option. So this is sort of the conclusion from the KDOT perspective and the project team as we've assembled all of this data over the last several months. Go ahead to the next slide, or should I pause there? And does anybody have any questions about some of these conclusions? Okay, I don't see anything on the chat. I don't see any hands. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So project next steps, and I'll start off, and Cameron, if you have more to add. So you've lost April. April looked like a whole mess of stuff, right? So we've gotten through the bulk of, you know, a lot of overlapping public engagement. We have an online public survey that is out. We're going to have focus groups later this month. We'll have the final results from those focus groups and the surveys at the end of the month. We're always scheduling community presentations. I want to see more blue dots. So if anybody knows anybody that needs more information, please let us know. We don't have another advisory group scheduled until later in the year, but we are meeting with the city in kind of that mid-June timeframe to hopefully get a direction on which option they want to move forward with. And we will be having additional conversations with them as we, you know, move through and collect this final information from the focus groups and surveys to get the sort of final last read on kind of where the public is and what we're hearing. So with that, I'll pause. And Cameron, do you have any additional information?
I mean, I think that you kind of hit it. It'll still be a busy May as we do.
Oh yeah.
It'll still be a busy May. Maybe not 3 advisory groups in a row with a public meeting sandwiched in between, but we will still be kind of, as Lindsay discussed, diving into these focus groups. And maybe the intent of doing another round of the surveys, another round of the focus groups is if you think about when we did this the last time, we didn't have all of this information at our disposal. We hadn't worked through the analysis of the last time that we had done it. So we did the first rounds of those really to help us understand what's the baseline level of understanding. And now that we have a lot of this, we have information about toll rates and how do the projects, how do the options differ, and what options does that present for the city of Overland Park. Now that we have that, that's kind of the part of the story that we want to reassess and kind of see what that looks like. And I think that will be very valuable information that we'll want to get into the hands of particularly the Overland Park City Council members as we move forward towards this decision. So still will be busy, but we are happy to be kind of where we are right now. And of course, we want to hear from you all. If there's some bit of missing information or an element that you think's been overlooked, then we will certainly want to know that. We really do appreciate
I would just add,
time.
Yeah. I mean, so it's not all said and done. This isn't, we're going to decide, if we're doing express toll lanes or we're going to do traditional widening and then the engagement with the public stops. It's not going to happen. We've got a long path of additional public engagement as we sort of finalize environmental review and we finalize, whichever project direction we decide to take. So we are far from done talking to people. We just needed to get through the tolling final analysis to make a decision so that then we can continue development of the project. So, there's a lot of ground that we still need to cover. And this has just been such a new idea and a different approach to what we've considered for other expansion projects. But I think your partnership has been absolutely invaluable to this process. And, any feedback that you have, whether you're comfortable saying it, now or, want to follow up with us, if there's stuff we're missing, there's more information that you think would be compelling that we could bring, please let us know. I think the project team has done an amazing job at getting this information pulled together. And it's been a huge team effort, and you guys are an essential member of that team. So thank you all very, very much. And please let us know if you have any questions or want additional information.
Are there any final questions before we officially wrap up? All right. Well, thank you all for.
Yeah. Any thoughts? Any oh, wow, I expected that, it would take even longer for the revenue, or that's way more revenue than I ever thought.
Or that takes forever.
Yeah. Any kind of reaction? Is it exactly what you were expecting? General observations, anything? Cameron and I joke, sometimes this group is very, very talkative and sometimes you're real quiet. I think we just found a quiet day, Cameron.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
And Lindsay and Cameron, I think it's safe to assume, isn't it, that if after people have absorbed and digested all this good information, if they have questions, that they can reach out with any additional comments or questions they might have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As is always the case.
Mm-hmm.
All right, all. Well, we really appreciate your guys' involvement and engagement in this up to this point. It won't be the last time that we get together. We might not get with you every 2-3 weeks like what we have been doing over the last little bit here, but we appreciate you guys being such an excellent sounding board and pushing us to consider the things that really we need to weigh here. So thank you very much. And again, if there's any other questions or whatever that you want to follow up later, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, guys.
That concludes today's meeting. Thank you all for participating.